Hi there, this is Stieg Strand with Remax Results. I'm going to be going through the purchase agreement, basically best practices. For many, many years, I taught the purchase agreement with Kaplan Professional Schools to people who were wanting to get their real estate license. So there's a lot of nooks and crannies in the purchase agreement. We're going to talk through that a little bit as we go through them. So I'm going to reduce myself a little bit and move up there, and we will start. Well, first of all, the date, whatever date it is, put it in. The purchase agreement, by the way, will refer to, and every other document that comes after this, addendums and amendments, will refer to the date of the purchase agreement. Now, the date of the purchase agreement should be today's date that you're drafting it, but everything else after it will revert back to that. So that date is important, and you will refer back to it, so you'll need to kind of remember that. So the buyers, you're going to insert their names here. Now, obviously, if it's a married couple, you'll put in both of their names, and sometimes, it's best to put in married people or married couple, so that people know they're married, but it doesn't really matter. And if they have two different last names or something like that, it doesn't matter a bunch. But what does matter is spell their name correctly. And also, this should be their legal name. Now, if it's like, let's say it's Bucky and their actual name is Bill, put Bill, okay? Or in Bill's case, it would probably be Robert or something like that. So it is going to be their legal name. Now, when it comes to earnest money, the amount of earnest money generically should be at least 1% of the purchase price. The more, the better. So, for instance, let's say the property was $250,000. You could kind of round it up to 3,000 or kind of round it down to 2,000. Now, would it be better to have more earnest money? Well, first of all, let's just look at the name, earnest money. Earnest means you are earnest, you are desirous, and you want to perform, and you want to purchase this property. So this is important. Now, by the way, this isn't a purchase agreement. What we're actually creating is an offer that we wish to become a purchase agreement. So in this offer, we have to have a dollar amount. So I would say, given everything else equal, 1% is the great place to start. Now, if you're dealing with a multiple offer situation, you're dealing with a situation where there's a lot of cash involved, maybe you want to increase that. Why? Because it shows more earnest. For instance, let's say it's a $300,000 property, and one purchase agreement or one offer comes in at $3,000 earnest money, and the other one comes in at $10,000 of earnest money. Now, given everything else equal, let's say the price is the same. Which one is going to be more attractive to a seller? The one that has $10,000 of earnest money, or the one that has $3,000 of earnest money? And again, given everything else equal, the answer is the more money, the better. The amount of money is just as refundable and just as safe or just as pledged as a higher amount. So if you pledge $500 versus $5,000, is the $5,000 less safe? And the answer is no. The earnest money and the rules about earnest money are all the same, no matter how much earnest money you put down. So if you have a buyer or you are a buyer and you want to kind of make your offer stronger, what you want to do is you want to have the highest amount of earnest money that is comfortable for you. And also, as a buyer, you should know that traditionally, the earnest money doesn't go anywhere until the offer is accepted, because the offer is then a purchase agreement. Once it's signed, it's a purchase agreement and delivered. Then that money is actually going to be funded or wired or whatever you plan for. We used to write checks, and of course, we really don't do that much anymore. We use what's called trust funds, and that is an electronic thing. So it does have to be liquid funds, but during the negotiation process, money does not need to move back and forth. This one here, the line 7. So line 7, what does that say? Well, it says it shall be delivered to listing broker, or if checked to blank within 2 business days of final acceptance. And by the way, that would be, then it's a purchase agreement. So where does it traditionally go? It traditionally goes to the listing agent. That's why it's a default. So this could be just left blank. Where else could it go? Well, let's say you're not using a regular brokerage, or there is no listing brokerage, whatever. You could have it being held by the title company. That's probably the most common is, ABC Title, Trademark Title, Results Title, First American Title, Edina Title, Watermark Title. There's all kinds of title companies, and they're happy to accept earnest money for a purchase agreement because they're going to pledge it, towards the closing. So when it comes to the earnest money, it's important to get it in the bank or get it in the process as soon as possible. Why? Well, a purchase agreement is a purchase agreement, whether money has been transferred or not. So just that's a fact. However, it doesn't make the seller feel really good if they're waiting for the earnest money. Does that make sense? In other words, well, we have an offer and we accepted it and it's now a purchase agreement, but we've been waiting for a week or more for that earnest money to come in for whatever reason. And the answer is that it's still tied up, it's still under contract, but the buyer, for whatever reason, doesn't hasn't produced the earnestness yet. So you can understand why that would be an important part of the process to get that done so that the seller has that affirmation. So, okay, so no later than 2 business days after final acceptance, and buyer and seller agreed. By the way, final acceptance will be discussed later, but final acceptance can be the date that we wrote the purchase agreement, but sometimes it's not. It's a few days later. So, buyer and seller agree that earnest money shall be deposited in the trust account of the earnest money holder, such as title company, as specified above within 3 business days of receipt. So we're actually talking about another time frame. So this is 2 business days to get it to the listing broker or whoever's going to hold it, and they have 3 business days to deposit it. And again, most of the time it's done electronically, so it's not really, it's not a 5-day process. So line 11, said earnest money is part payment for the purchase of the property. So that is going to be pledged. A lot of buyers will ask, well, is this in addition to, or, it's part of the down payment. So, well, what happens in a situation like with a VA or something like that? Just like a veterans loan could be 100% financing and their closing costs could be covered. So, by the seller. So what does that mean as far as the earnest money is concerned? Well, I always try to liken it to this. Sellers like earnestness, even if it doesn't need to be there, because they have the ability to produce that money. It makes them feel a little more secure. So in the VA sense, I have written purchase agreements for my buyers who are going to do VA and they were going to do primarily nothing down. And they still wrote healthy earnest money checks so that the seller knew that they were secure. Now, is that needed? No. Is it something that should be discussed between the 2 agents or the buyer and the seller? Yes. You don't want to make an offer with little or no earnest money in a veterans, in a VA setting, and honestly, even in an FHA setting, because with an FHA, you could also have that similar situation where the seller is giving, a portion of the amount of closing costs and so on and so forth. I've had buyers in a number of different times buy a house for a couple $100. I mean, it's just literally, it's just crazy. So what it boils down to is that even though they may get a refund at closing, you want to, given everything else equal, have the seller feel comfortable about that amount of earnest money. So anyway, so there's the address of the property and what the legal description is, 12, 13, 14, and 15 on those lines there. So that is an important thing, and legally described generically is some sort of lot and block. If it's kind of more out in the exurbs or rural, it's going to have a long, it could very easily have a long legal description. You can put it in there if it fits. If it doesn't fit, it's too long, then you can say legal description to conform to above street address. That's a kind of a generic catch-all, and I'll say that again. Legal description will conform to above street address. You can put that in there, and that will be just fine. And that I've done too is instead of, I'll put a PID in there. So a lot of times, most things that are sold are one PID. One, it's taxed on that PID, that property identification number. That's how the counties and the state and everybody, taxes. They tax based on PIDs. So that's another mechanism. But I've had many occasions when a buyer is buying and a seller is selling 1 or 2 or 3 lots with 1 or 2 or 3 PIDs. So it is important to understand that. So now we have 16 through a whole bunch. Now this is basically everything you can possibly imagine that could be thought of with the home, because every time the purchase agreement gets updated, and it gets updated about every year or two, this long list gets longer and longer, and we can see it's shrubs and bulbs and containment systems for pets. And by the way, that would be like an invisible fence, curtain rods, draperies, anything that's there, towel rods, toilet paper holders. All of these things are basic stuff that you forget about that's included in the property. Now, if the seller really loves their, antique chandelier, or, if there's any number of things it could be. Now, I'll just point this one out, plants. It is perfectly normal for someone to have plants and then want to take them to their new home. That's a very normal thing. So, just something I might add is that that is normal and you need to get that negotiated. So, if you are going to a home or you writing a purchase agreement on the home and they have a beautiful garden, I would highly recommend you make sure are they going to want any of those bulbs, in the spring, or maybe it's corn and soybeans probably not, but well, and that's actually a good place to start. There is corn and soybeans an example of what's called an emblement, and an emblement is basically the fruit of the land. And apples, apple tree, pears, pear tree, corn, corn plants, things like that. So anything that it produces that someone else planted means that it's the seller's or the person who owned the property's property. Okay, it's theirs. All of those apples are theirs. But most people kind of forget about that. So it is something to discuss in advance so that the buyer knows, oh, yeah, well, we're not going to get any of those apples, or we'll get half of the apples, or all we really want is a couple of buckets. That is a really good way to kind of talk it through. And the rest of this stuff is mostly built in things that may be there. Okay. Like I can see right there, warming drawers on line 28. Most people don't have a warming drawer. They might have a warming drawer in their stove, but they don't usually have a separate warming drawer. If they do, that's pretty cool. So it's either kind of an older, cool, modern house for that age, or it's a very modern house with lots of cool stuff. So it's important to go through this and recognize what people are talking about when it comes to what is included in the home. And it goes to the ridiculous toilet mechanisms, which would be when you're flushing the toilet, toilet paper holders. Now, traditionally on line 33, it'll say something to the effect of, and personal property shall be transferred with no additional monetary value. And that's actually technically not true. In Minnesota, at least, all title companies, they will do a bill of sale at closing, and it's usually sold for $1. But what I'm getting at here is that it could say in here, and it would be highly recommended to say CSEE personal property addendum on line 33. So CSEEPP addendum is what I would put. And then basically now that personal property is discussed specifically in another piece of paper and not inside of this great big block of information. So on line 33, that would be a great place to add that. Okay, so 34, notwithstanding foregoing leased fixtures. Leased fixtures, by the way, the one that pops in my head all the time on this one would be internet equipment, number one, because a lot of that stuff is leased. Xfinity loves it when you pay $5 or $10 or $20 a month. I mean, a water softener. A water softener would be a very big example of like Culligan or whatever. They will lease those out, given everything else equal, because it'll be a lower. If you lease, you have a lower payment when you first install it. But if you want to purchase it, then you've got to write them a check for $1,000 or more dollars in order to do that. So most people, at least initially, lease their water softeners, which would be in there too. You need to know that. Last but not least on that particular section on line 36, what is excluded? Now this may need to be longer or bigger, but this is where it would be grandma's chandelier. It could be, furniture, really nice furniture. It could be, I sold a house one time not too long ago that had built-in speakers that were in a custom wall of basically, they had a big screen TV and they had custom, beautiful, large, very expensive speakers. And the seller said, I will leave them, but I want money for them. And he wanted, I think it was like 5 or 10,000. It was a lot of money, and they were really cool speakers. And in the end, the seller got, I think it was $2,500 for everything, which I thought was a pretty good deal. He was a little upset, but they got a premium for the house. But what I'm getting at is that those are important things to think about: is built-in stuff or stuff that was customized built in. Okay. On line 36, last but not least, if there is nothing that the seller is wanting to take away, okay, other than obvious things, you can put in there none disclosed. Okay, I like to put none disclosed in an area where there could be a disclosure. So what does that do? That basically says to the seller, if I'm writing this, I'm probably representing the buyer. But if I'm writing it, I want to make sure that the seller knows, here's the point in time which you're going to tell me if there is something you want to keep, because I'm writing down none disclosed. Does that make sense? So anyway, there's purchase agreement part 1. Hope you enjoyed it. Please like or subscribe. Okay, bye-bye.